Hi there. Welcome to Conservation Conversations. This is where we dive deep into the trials and triumphs of conservation in Africa. And on this journey, we'll be dissecting Africa's conservation challenges and uncovering some really cool homegrown solutions. I'm your host, Elizabeth Gitari Mitaro. So today I want us to have a conversation about the finance bill of 2024. I'm pretty sure that you've all seen it. You might have read through it. You might have read some analysis by some institutions or other people engaged in conversations with your relatives, your friends, your colleagues on what this actually means. And it seems like since this government came into power, all we've been talking about is taxes. And I think it's really critical for us to acknowledge that for us to be able to move forward and to grow as a country, there is probably no getting out of the conversation around taxes being raised. It is true that in 2024, we pay more taxes than what we used to pay, say, in 1974 or in 1954. The truth of the matter is, in 2074, we will probably be paying a lot more taxes than we currently pay today. And I'm pretty sure most of you who are economists or who work in the public sector and the finance sector will be able to give, a contribution to this conversation around why that is. And so, given that we are where we are, and we desire for a country that actually is moving forward in terms of economic development, that we desire for a higher standard of living, that we desire to have access to public goods, that we desire when we go to hospital, to government hospitals, we get top quality attention, that when we send our children to school, they're not learning under trees or in classrooms that are leaking. And so there are, and I'm oversimplifying this obviously because I'm a conservationist and not an economist as it were, but the two ways to go about this. You either raise taxes and you expand the tax bracket and the tax net so that the taxes that are collected then go on to be invested into these public goods, into hospitals, infrastructure, and all of that. And you can also incentivize the sectors of the economy that have a net positive impact on the economy, and you disincentivize the sectors of the economy that have a net negative impact on the economy and on our livelihoods as Kenyan citizens. And so what I want us to do today is really have a conversation on whether or not this finance bill provides a net positive impact in respect to biodiversity and conservation. What are some of the clauses that you need to look at a lot more closely and give your views on a lot more closely during the public participation process so that we are all participants in the creation of the future that we desire as a country. And so, as a means of background, the Finance Bill of 2024, going forward, I'll call it the bill. So anytime I say the bill, we're referring to the Finance Bill, was presented before Parliament on the 9th of May this year. And this Finance Bill is a Finance Bill that's tabled every single year. And what it does is that it amalgamates all the various amendments to the country's diverse tax-related laws. Okay? So some of the tax-related laws that we have in the country involve the Income Tax Act, involve the Value Added Tax Act. We also have the Excise Duty Act and the Tax Procedures Act. These four acts of Parliament are what actually govern our tax infrastructure. So every single year, the government proposes a bill that introduces key amendments across the different legislative instruments that deal with tax. And this is also including the Miscellaneous Fees and the Levies Act. So what the Finance Bill does is that it proposes different amendments to different acts of Parliament that have an impact on our tax infrastructure. It doesn't have to be a money bill or a money act that is influenced by the Finance Act. For example, in this year's Finance Bill, the Data Protection Act is also proposed to be amended. The Data Protection Act is in and of itself is not a finance act or a tax act. So what this bill, a detailed reading through it and a summary of it, what it's proposing to do is essentially to widen the tax base and meet the projected budget revenues for the coming year, 2024-2025, that is meant to start on the 1st of July. And these key measures then include the expansion of definitions. What does digital content monetization mean, for example? What the bill also proposes different or additional definitions to the terms, for example, digital marketplace. It's introducing some taxes that were non-existent in the previous financial year. And so all of this is what is included in the bill. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to isolate some key clauses in the bill that have a direct or a near direct impact on conservation efforts and what we need to do. Some of those impacts are going to be some of those impacts are going to be direct. Some of those impacts are going to be indirect in conservation. And so let's get into it. So let's start with the proposed changes to the Income Tax Act, Chapter 470 of the Laws of Kenya. And I won't go through all the amendments that are being proposed to the income tax. I'm just going to isolate two that have a direct or near direct impact on conservation. The first one is the Act is proposing to expand the definition of the term digital content monetization and then introduce a withholding tax on any income that is derived from that and actually increase it from the current 5% and put it all the way up to 25%. Now, the Finance Act of 2023 introduced a 5% withholding tax on payments made to digital content creators, and it defined digital content monetization as the offering of various types of material electronically for payment. And this would then include things like brand promotions, sponsorships, affiliate marketing, subscription services, crowdfunding, so on and so forth. So, for example, if we had a paid subscription service to this podcast, any income that is derived from that, we would have to pay a 5% withholding tax to the government. Now, what this current bill is doing is that it's expanding this definition of digital content monetization to include all creative works and shared materials that are not currently exempt under the Act. All right? It proposes a 5% withholding tax on digital content payments for resident persons and 20% for non-resident persons. What this means is that the tax net is then widened and it's recognizing the growing space of content creation as a country. So what does this amendment and review of digital content monetization mean from a conservation perspective? Now, the Act does not specifically or directly address environmental conservation in this particular aspect, but it does from an indirect perspective. And how does it do this? Number one, the Act broadens the definition of anyone who calls themselves a digital content creator. So if you're a conservation organization that is putting out content digitally and asking for subscriptions to either your organization, your content, donations, so on and so forth, if you're not already tax exempt, that particular income would be subject to the withholding tax that is being proposed by this particular bill. That's one. So your accountants will have to go back to your books and actually put aside that money, calculate what 5% is, and pay it. And remember that withholding tax is payable at the point of receiving. So it is not the same as the tax that is paid at the end of the year, i.e. income tax. So for withholding tax, it will be payable on a monthly to monthly basis. All right. The second indirect impact of this particular provision is that because of the increased tax burden on content creators, there's going to be less investment by content creators and production houses in environmentally friendly content production practices, which would then mean that there's a potential reduction of the overall impact of environmental conservation efforts. Thirdly, this would also mean that anyone who's producing content for the education of the masses or for environmental awareness and all of this, because there is perceived income from that digital content creation, it would then mean that there is a discouragement of citizens and organizations getting into the digital content creation space, specifically for conservation efforts. So let's look at the second proposal for amendment under the income tax. The bill proposes an introduction of a motor vehicle tax, and I'll refer to that going forward as the MVT, at a rate of 2.5% of a vehicle's value determined by make, by model, by engine capacity, and year of manufacture. And this particular tax is then payable upon issuance of the insurance ticket with a minimum of 5,000 and a maximum of 100,000. All right? So if 2.5% of the value of a car is less than 5,000, then the payable amount would be 5,000 and not the minimum that is less than 5,000. And the responsibility of collection is placed on insurance companies, and it is the insurance companies who would be facing penalties for non-compliance. Now, the biggest issue that we are finding with this MVT is that there is a lack of clarity in terms of the revenue collection strategy. Last year, when the housing levy was introduced and Okoiti and 6 others took the government to court, challenging the introduction of the housing levy, the court was very clear by saying that tax implementation procedure should be addressed before any tax is collected or implemented. So the government has a duty to tell the citizens of Kenya that for this new introduction of the MVT, this is how it's going to be collected, and these are the terms and regulations surrounding it. Now, from a conservation perspective, the MVT is a welcome tax. Why is it a welcome tax? The assumption is that the higher the value of the vehicle, the higher the 2.5% will be that will be collected, right? And so this is going to dissuade people from buying, vehicles. The converse of that is that you will find that people will be discouraged from changing their vehicles that have now become, I don't want to use the word obsolete, but have become damaging to the environment because of engine problems, so on and so forth. So the newer the technology that we are getting, for example, when we have electric vehicles and better technology surrounding fuel consumption, those are vehicles that are going to be newer and therefore higher in value, which would then mean that the motor vehicle tax to be paid on those vehicles that are actually beneficial to the environment, well, not really beneficial, but less damaging to the environment, is going to be higher, dissuading people from actually doing it. So as we currently stand, because of the increase in the dollar exchange rates that we experienced at the beginning of the year, the additional taxes, the cost of living, people are still not changing their vehicles as much as they would. You'd find that someone would potentially plan to change their vehicle every 5 years. And now that person cannot afford to change their vehicle every 5 years because of these additional taxes. What does that mean? That we still continue to have vehicles that are damaging to the environment because of their engine problems and because of the lack of technology around fuel efficiency and so on and so forth. And this is now going to negatively impact the environment. So we've addressed the two main concerns around the amendments in the income tax. Let's now move to the proposed changes to the Value Added Tax Act of 2013. The number one proposal that would immediately impact conservation efforts is the removal of VAT exemptions that had been given to the tourism sector. There are certain goods that were previously exempt from VAT or from value-added tax under the tourism sector. This particular bill proposes a reintroduction of VAT. What does that mean? That the incentivization of growth that had happened before, by the virtue that tourism investors and operators within the tourism sector would not have had to pay tax, their cost of business operation has now gone higher because of the reintroduction of this VAT. Now, it's important to note that obviously tourism sector is a key player in environmental conservation, primarily because Kenya's tourism sector relies heavily on Kenya's biodiversity. And so the more we incentivize business growth for tourism operators, then the higher our income as a country, specifically because then we would have more tourist operators and tourism investors in the country. But this has also to be a net positive growth. So we are probably going to see an increase in cost of tourism expeditions, specifically because tourism investors and tourism operators now have to pay value-added tax on certain goods that they previously did not have to pay. There is also an introduction for the payment of tax on infrastructure bonds. What this means is that a lot of the investors and a lot of companies that were investing in infrastructure bonds in the hope or from the incentive perspective that they did not have to pay withholding tax on this would then be dissuaded or it would be harder to persuade them to invest in infrastructure bonds. And so one of the ways that the government could counteract this negative implication is through changes in the Excise Duty Act. The Excise Duty Act is, there are certain proposed changes that are going to see an increase in how much tax is paid to move money around. And this would then mean that all of the conservation money that we pay, or the conservation money that moves from organizations to communities to support certain initiatives, there's going to be an increased cost of doing business, especially if we are moving money, large tracts of money to support community-based organizations and so on and so forth. And so the cost of doing business and the cost of conservation efforts is going to be increased from a perspective of the cost of moving money specifically. So in as much as most of the proposed changes to the Excise Duty Act do not specifically directly or indirectly impact conservation, there are certain ways that the government or certain proposals that the government can use to actually ensure that the Excise Duty Act promotes sustainability. And some of these are an introduction of green bonds or green taxes. So if we are able to, from a green taxes perspective, if the government can introduce higher excise duties on goods and services that have a net negative impact on the environment, then we would be discouraging consumption of these particular goods from a manufacturing perspective as well as from a retailer perspective, but also encourage people to choose more sustainable alternatives. The other amendment that's being introduced in the VAT Act is the removal of VAT applicability to aeroplane spare parts and heavy machinery. So they've become tax exempt. How does this actually affect conservation? So most of the conservation organizations that have aeroplanes that do, air rescue, that transport veterinary doctors into remote parts of our protected areas to take care of our elephants and rhinos and so on and so forth. So most of these organizations will now get a reprieve from having to import the spare parts and the service parts for most of these aeroplanes and their heavy machinery. So what would I do if I was a conservation organization that actually owns an aeroplane or a helicopter or whatever it is? I would make sure that if this provision passes, my personal opinion is that it might actually not pass because there's a lot of uproar around how this is actually incentivizing the rich and the elite and removing tax burden from them whilst placing the tax burden on the common mwananchi. But in the event that it passes, then the advice would be to import as many of these parts as possible if the 16% VAT makes an actual difference in the importation of or in the cost of doing business, so that then that cost is actually lowered. And so there'll be less expenditure for these conservation organizations from that perspective. And lastly, let's discuss the proposed changes to the Miscellaneous Fees and Levies Act of 2016. And the key proposal here that I'd like us to have a conversation about is the proposed introduction of an equal levy on specified goods, either manufactured here domestically or imported into the country. Now, what this levy is intended to do is to mitigate the environmental damage caused by these specific goods, and the goods would then be detailed in the fourth schedule of the Miscellaneous Fees and Levies Act. So what will be the conservation impact of this? Essentially, this introduction of the eco levy aligns with ESG principles, environmental, social, and governance principles, and the global environmental protection initiatives that are currently on board in Kenya, by virtue of Kenya being a signatory to a lot of these conventions, the Convention on Biological Diversity, so on and so forth. And so what this levy will do is that it will ensure that manufacturers and importers actually bear the financial responsibility for the environmental impact of these products. The downside of it is that we all know that manufacturers and importers pass on the cost of this to consumers. And so to one entity as an importer, so let's assume that one of the goods that this eco-levy, that attracts this eco-levy might be the importation of used car tires into the country. And the government decides that there's going to be a 10% introduction or a 10% tax on the import of used car tires, to reduce the issue of, dumping, use of Kenya as a country that you can dump, used car tires and so on and so forth. Now, the importer of these car tires, the cost to him as one entity is going to be high. Let's assume that 10% comes to 10 million. So it's high to him as an individual, but he's going to distribute it to yourself, myself, your brother, your sister, all our colleagues. That 10 million, so that you find that if I'm going to buy used car tires from the shop, the cost to me individually of buying that used car tire that has an eco-levy on it is only 1,000 shillings more. This is in comparison to me going and buying a new tire that is going to cost me 15 or 20,000 shillings more. So at the end of the day, the eco-levy is going to be passed on to the consumer, to the ultimate consumer, who is going to make the decision that buying of this product makes a lot more financial sense. I am willing to pay the eco-levy addition as opposed to paying the pretty high markup for the environmentally conscious good. So there's need to rethink the use of the eco-levy, because from a macro perspective, it looks like a really good direction to go. But then we find ourselves in a situation where the cost is passed on to the consumer. The consumer accepts it as a cost of doing business. And we are still back to square one, where we are paying high taxes and yet we are still having the same environmental impact. So one of the ways perhaps of circumventing this negative application of this will be to require that the eco-levy is paid directly by the manufacturer or the importer, as well as criminalizing or placing liability if the manufacturer and the importer passes on the eco-levy to the ultimate consumer or to the consumer of his goods and services. This actually ensures that the manufacturer is actually disincentivized from dealing with goods that are environmentally damaging, essentially. The other aspect of the eco-levy that I'd like to talk about is the introduction of an eco-tax of 750 shillings per kilogram of battery weight. What does this actually mean? So if a car battery of 12 kilograms is retailing at, say, 8,500 shillings, then when this new eco-tax is introduced, that same car battery would go up to 17,500 Kenya shillings. This is 120% increase. And remember that solar batteries, are not actually excluded from the impact of this eco-tax. So the larger solar batteries would actually see a price increase of all the way up to 45,000 shillings per unit. So what does this actually mean? That we are disincentivizing the investment in alternative, cleaner sources of energy in the long run. And so with these specific price jumps, we would see some of these devices becoming a luxury item that's only available to the wealthy. And we would then see less and lesser people actually buy, and eventually industries and conservation efforts that would not be able to sustain these prices in the long run shut down, and this would then lead to a loss of jobs, right? And so all of these concerns are incredibly important to outline in a document and to provide input in the public participation process. At the beginning of the podcast, we said that the bill was tabled before Parliament on the 9th of May, and there's a continuous public participation process that Kenyans are invited to actually share their views. Now, I know it's incredibly satisfying for us to sit in our living rooms, for us to write in our WhatsApp groups, for us to discuss it with our friends when we are out for a drink or we are out for a hike. But if it stops there, then the government has no idea what's going on in your Chama group or what's going on in your boys club or what's going on your WhatsApp group and what your views are in regards to this particular document. So what's the public participation process and how do we get involved in it? You can do this in two ways. you can put together a memorandum document and send it to the email address that's in the description box that's going to go to the clerk of the National Assembly as your contribution and your views. And we're going to provide a template for what that memorandum looks like. All you have to do is email admin@ogo-law.com, admin@ogo-law.com, or send us a direct message on Instagram, on X, or on LinkedIn, and we're going to send the document to you. Edit it and send it to the email address. Number 2, at each county government office, there is a desk that's receiving written views from the citizens on this finance bill. Walk into any county government office, tell them you're there to give your views on the act or the bill for this matter, and they will direct you on how to get that done. And number 3, there are various barazas or town halls that are being held across the country on this particular bill. That information, you will find it from your local chief. You will also find it from your county government offices. So just walk into your county government offices or to your local chief and ask them for information on when the next baraza in your area of locality, your geographical location will be. Attend it and give your views. This is the only way that we can move from grumblings and complaining on WhatsApp groups, on our chama tables, at our drinking dens, on our hikes, at our picnics, and actually move the conversation to policymakers and make a tangible difference. And that's all the time we have for today on Conservation Conversations. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really do hope that you've learned something new and that you actually feel empowered to take action towards a more sustainable future for all of us. Remember, even small changes make a huge difference. This conversation doesn't stop here. Please do connect with us on our social media channels at greenbrief_KE and at Liz Gitari across all platforms. We'll put all the links in the description box below. Until next time, keep well and keep changing the world.